Bloody murders were imminent. Smack dab in center aisle, 10th row, Kevin Penny sat with his friend Eddie and Anthony, waiting for the deaths to begin. The movie screen was splashed now with the images of Susie, a gorgeous blonde in cutoffs and a well-filled T-shirt, and Lance, the muscular young camp counselor. They were sitting on a picnic table by a bunch of hedges, and they were necking. This was boring to Kevin Penny. He wanted the exciting stuff to start, and he had the feeling that the gardener there, the one with the hockey mask and the hedge trimmer, was going to get things going. "What's wrong?" said Susie as Lance came up for air, looking around apprehensively. "Isn't it awful late to be trimming the lawn? Maybe that guy's a peeping Tom or something." "Well, let's give him something to peep at," said Susie, pulling her hunk back down. There was a cut to a close-up of the hedge trimmer, whirling and cutting twigs and leaves. Kevin Penny shuddered deliciously, stuffing his face with a handful of popcorn. To his left, Eddie and Anthony were wolfing down jujubes and nobody's business. There was the air of the forbidden here in the dank and musty movie theater, and it gave Kevin an extra charge to be doing just what his mother had told him not to do. But that's what was happening on the screen, and it wasn't exciting. Boy, it sure was. "I'm telling you," said the camp counselor in the movie, "something's weird about that guy. Hockey season ended months ago." Behind the boys was a moviegoer and was talking loudly to his date. "Watch this," he said. He gets the camp counselor with the electric garden weasel, but the girl gets away. The whirring got louder, and sure enough, here came Puckface, slamming down his weapon onto poor Lance. Popcorn splattered as Kevin put salty fingers up to cover his eyes. Ugh! Blood everywhere! He couldn't help but notice that Eddie and Anthony didn't stir at all. They just stared and chuckled, eating all up along with their candy. "Watch," said the goofball behind him. "She's going to run in the lodge and hide." Kevin was getting annoyed. His first slasher film was being ruined by some jerk who'd seen it before and insisted on telegraphing the upcoming action. Kevin turned and put his finger to his lips. Shh. As Kevin Penny expressed his annoyance upstairs in the projection booth, Phil Hobbs, who had seen the movie many times, leaned back in his chair and turned the page of his old creepy magazine. The projectionist had read it before, and it wasn't as good as the old EC horror comics he collected, but he couldn't read his precious ECs at work. They'd get ruined since he tended to suck down cokes and smear his comics with peanut grease while unspooling the evening's entertainment. You had to find something to do up here between pushing the on button to the film and rewinding the thing, or you'd go crazy. Phil Hobbs liked to read comics, he liked to play with his yo-yo, and he liked companionship. The companionship he'd found in a pet he bought some years ago, a spider monkey. He called the monkey Charlie, and Charlie really dug being assistant projectionist. He was also real good at shelling peanuts and damn generous for a monkey. That was exactly what he was doing now, perched atop the rewind table, shelling peanuts. He took two from their husk, gave one to Phil, and ate the other. "Thanks, Charlie," said Phil Hobbs, chomping down on the nut, then flipping the page of the old black-and-white comic, not missing a flip of his yo-yo. Charlie chittered in reply. "Geez, what do you think, Charlie?" said Hobbs, realizing that he was sweating. "Getting kind of hot in here, isn't it?" "Stuffy, too. Think we should report bad working conditions to the management or to the union?" He got up to check the air conditioning vent. "Thing's giving off nothing, and on a night like this. Maybe the vent's clogged or something." He unlatched the vent and opened it. Still not a bit of cool air was forthcoming. "Wonderful," said Phil Hobbs. "No, the union won't get the results as fast as we need them." He went to the phone and called down to Clyde Mitchell, the manager, still keeping the yo-yo going, executing some tricky moves to keep his mind off the heat. "Hey, Clyde," he said on the phone. On the other end, "It's Hobbs. Listen, it's boiling up here. The air conditioning on?" "Sure is," said Mitchell. "And you know I'm not paying a pretty penny for it." "Well, it isn't happening up here. Come up and see for yourself if you don't believe me." He cradled the receiver and continued his yo-yoing as he delved back into his vampire story. Should have brought a Vampirella comic, he thought. He liked any given vampy story better than the usual run of creepy vampire stories. Charlie the spider monkey didn't care much about the heat, but something did attract his attention. A barely audible metallic creaking sound was coming from the duct that his master had opened. Charlie wondered what the hell it was, and his curiosity got the better of him. He abandoned his paper bag of peanuts and skittered over there, jumping up to the edge and perching, looking into the dark hole. Creak, creak, creak. When Phil Hobbs held his hand out for his next peanut, he received nothing. He looked up from his comic and saw no monkey on the rewind table. "Charlie?" He swiveled around and caught movement at the air conditioning duct, Charlie's tail just disappearing. Good Lord, the simian simpleton had gone into the hole. "Hey!" cried Phil Hobbs, and rushed to the hole. "Charlie, get out of there!" In the hole there was only darkness. He could see nothing. He stuck his head in, calling for his pet. "Charlie?" His voice echoed into the piping. "Where the hell are you?" It gobbled down the tiny creature, but the protoplasm only maddened it. Food. More food. It had lain a while in the sewers, feeding on rats and digesting its prey from the phone booth and from the police car it had invaded, but its raging need for more flesh and blood had urged it out of its hole, up and up, to where it sensed many animate bags of blood. More food. And now the blob saw the man sticking his head into the duct, and it raced up toward the vibrations of his voice and the pulsing of his blood. Clyde Mitchell, the manager of the Morgan City Theater, walked up the steps towards the projection booth. He couldn't figure out for the life of him what was wrong with the air conditioning. He checked the units downstairs, and they were churning along, nice as you please. Still, he didn't want to upset his projectionist. Hobbs was a good one, and they were hard to get in the town of Morgan City. Mitchell was young yet, and he had aspirations of heading for the top of the chain of theaters that he worked for. But he wouldn't get anywhere if this job wasn't run efficiently. At the top of the stairs he tried the door, and it was locked. And he rattled it a bit, but no one came to open it. "Come on, Hobbs, put the yo-yo down and open this door." No answer. Well, he had a key ring. Wearily he pulled the proper key and opened the door. The film was still chugging away, light flickering along the front of the booth, almost like an erratic strobe, but otherwise the room was dark. The manager pulled out his usher's flashlight and swept it across the room in a slow arc. Phil Hobbs was nowhere to be seen. "Hobbs? You in here?" he called, becoming apprehensive. It came down with a whirl. The yo-yo. It came down from the ceiling and bumped there at the end of the string, and something was dripping down it. Mitchell jumped back. What the hell? He automatically swung the flashlight up, cutting through the shadows. Phil Hobbs, the projectionist, seems to be embedded in the ceiling. Some kind of runny glob was holding him there, like an insect stuck in tree sap. Even as Clyde Mitchell looked, he could see the light going out of the man's eyes. Could see the skin starting to melt away, exposing cartilage and skull as the jaw opened and closed and the body switched and jerked. And then Mitchell could see that Hobbs' body was being dragged across the ceiling, that the whole ceiling was a writhing mess. It seemed alive, and more gunk was spewing up from out of the air conditioning duct. Stunned, the manager could only think, so that's why he wasn't getting any AC. The ropes of slime dropped from the ceiling surrounding him. Terrified, he turned to escape, but the whole door was covered in a sheath of gunk. The audience in the theater screamed as the hockey mask killer struck again. As though on cue, Clyde Mitchell screamed as well as the ceiling dropped down on him. Meg Penny fumed as she was jerked and jostled by the military van zooming through town. That damned Brian Flagg. He'd just flown the coop, and there she'd thought he was showing some special quality she'd never imagined he possessed all these years. She actually felt something for the jerk. He couldn't go through what they'd been through together and not feel something. But then he'd abandon her, just like that, to save his own rotten skin. The van squeaked to a halt, and Meg heard the sound of footsteps running up to open the back door. The door was opened by another of those plastic-suited soldiers who motioned her out. As she stepped onto the pavement, she realized where she was, the center of Morgan City, the town hall. The town hall was 2 stories of ivy-covered brick, situated to the north of the tree-lined town square. Usually it projected an image of dignity and austerity, but tonight all was chaos. White-suited soldiers ran hither and yon, escorting Morgan City citizens to shelters. Meg could see medical teams working with clumps of people, checking them out for infections under artificial lights. Lots of them were still in their bedclothes, having been roused from sleep. Yes, now the town hall was the town emergency relief station. From the top of a military half-track, a loudspeaker blared, "Please assemble in an orderly fashion and cooperate fully with our medical personnel." The soldier who had opened the door for her thumped the side of the van and his fist and shouted, "Clear!" A little dazed and discombobulated, Meg walked forward into the confused scene looking for her parents. She found them quickly. They were in a line for medical attention, along with 2 people she recognized as Eddie's parents. Mrs. Penny was holding her little baby sister, Christine. "Mom! Dad!" she called, running to them. Mrs. Penny welcomed her with a frantic hug. "Meg, thank God you're all right." "Where have you been?" said her father. "You had us scared out of our minds." She looked around, noticing an absence. Kevin. What had happened to our little brother? "Where's Kevin?" she asked. "He probably snuck off to that damn movie," said her mother. "He told us he was staying over at Eddie's." Eddie's mother, Mrs. Beckner, looked dismayed. "Eddie told us he was staying at your place." This was terrible, the thought of little Kevin and that horrible monster. A soldier was passing by, and Meg reached out and grabbed him. "Excuse me," she said. "My little brother's over at the movie theater on Main." "Miss, we're going by sectors. We'll get there shortly." "You don't understand." The soldier brushed her off. "We'll handle this, okay?" Mr. Penny, however, clearly didn't care for the soldier's attitude, and Daddy was a very confrontational man. "I don't see you handling much of anything, bub. You on a coffee break?" "Look, mister," the soldier began. "No, don't look, Mr. Me. I'm a taxpayer. I pay your salary." Everyone was listening to the argument, which gave Meg the perfect opportunity to slip away. She had to get to the movie theater, get Kevin to a safe place, and keep him there. This was no night for a 10-year-old to be out on the town. Kevin Penny was getting really steamed. This joker in the seat behind him was making a real nuisance of himself. Clearly he'd seen the film before, but why did he have to broadcast what was coming up? Eddie and Anthony didn't seem to mind. They were into the gore and the mayhem, not the suspense. But Kevin had always enjoyed suspenseful stuff from the first time that a grown-up had played peekaboo with him when he was a baby. But there was no suspense in Garden Tool Murders, not with Big Mouth blaring behind him. He tried to ignore the guy and turn his attention to the screen where two pretty co-eds in nighties were talking insanely as they made salads. But Kevin couldn't hear what they were saying. Big Mouth drowned them out. "Oh, you'll love this," said the guy. "He takes the Vegematic and dices them to death." That was the last straw. Kevin was fed up. He was going to give this guy a piece of his mind just the way Dad would. In fact, he pretended he was Dad now. Dad with a mad on as he turned to confront Big Mouth. But as he turned, expecting to see the bespectacled man with a bad haircut, he was buffeted by a faint wind. There was a blur of motion, and he got a glimpse only of what was heels of the guy's wingtips as he was yanked up into the air. Kevin and the guy's girlfriend stared up dumbfounded. What they saw was infinitely worse than any killer wearing a hockey mask and waving a garden hoe. Some kind of awful glop was spilling out of the three projectionist windows behind the audience. Only it wasn't like it was just liquid. It looked like some kind of loose clay, animated. A tendril of the stuff had whipped down, lassoed Big Mouth, and pulled him up towards the greater mass. Big Mouth was screaming. But then the screaming stopped as he was pushed head first into the writhing mass with no splash. His legs and arms wriggled frantically, and then blood and some other liquid started pouring down over the heads of the audience. Screams began, louder than any movie had ever aroused. "Look at that!" cried Kevin, pounding on Eddie and Anthony to attract their attention. Even as they looked, gobs of the muck rolled down into the aisle, grabbing a woman and pulling her off her feet. Panic seized the crowd. The projector jammed, freezing the movie on the image of a screaming co-ed, and then the hot light burned the image away, even as the creature invading the movie theater burned away the face of a man with a flick of a pseudopod. The audience became a mob. Panicked, they ran for their lives toward the bright red exit signs. "We gotta get out of here," said Anthony, as the boys ran into the aisle. They were hit by running people. Anthony was carried along with the crowd, but Eddie and Kevin were knocked down onto the sticky popcorn-covered carpet. The creature rolled toward them. The people came exploding out of the theater, and Meg Penny immediately knew why. The creature was in there. The monster was in there, and so was her little brother Kevin. She fought her way through the fear-crazed crowd and through the doors. She smelled the thing before she saw it. The gut-wrenching acidy smell and the blood and the taint of the sewer. She looked up the aisle, and sure enough, there it was, bigger than before, incredibly big, spouting through the projection booth openings and pouring down the walls and aisles like oatmeal lava, pouring through a flickering nightmare. "Kevin!" she cried, fighting her way through the crush of bodies. "Kevin!" There were groans and cries and screams everywhere, dominated by the obscene squelching sound the creature made as it wriggled through, grabbing people in a feeding frenzy. Meg was knocked over. A man above her tried to run along the top of a row of seats towards the exit. But with no whipping sound, a pseudopod lashed around his midsection, tore him away with a yelp, and dragged him back into the main mass of the thing. "Kevin!" she cried, pulling herself up, but she was immediately knocked down, landing just inches away from the face of a woman who had been half dissolved from forehead to chin. A scream struggled to break free, but she choked it back. "Have to find Kevin," she told herself. "Have to find Kevin." She screamed again, "Kevin!" getting back up. Meg? She turned toward the sound of the yell. There he was, still alive. He and Eddie were cowering in a corner near the theater's curtain as people surged past. She dodged around a row of seats and struck out towards them. The crowd was thinning out. Either the creature had got them, or they had escaped from the theater. She reached the boys, and taking no time to hug Kevin, wrenched them away from where they stood and pointed toward the side exit. "This way!" she cried. But even as they ran, Meg saw peripherally the pseudopod lapping toward them over the seats in the strobing darkness. "Down!" she called, pushing the boys down onto the floor. The tendril flopped over them at freight train speed, smashing a plaster angel on the side wall into dust. "Come on!" cried Meg. "Hurry!" The boys responded instantly, getting to their feet and running with her to the exit. Meg could hear the surging horror lapping at their feet. The exit door was traditionally gray metal variety, a heavy-duty lock. Meg and the boys burst through it into the alley. Meg had a glimpse of the thing filling up the short hallway behind them. She had to close that door. That thing was going so fast. Meg slammed the door behind her. She heard and felt the thing pound against the other side like tons of dough striking a kneading counter. The door clicked shut, locking behind them. Meg permitted herself a quick sigh of relief. "Hurry!" she cried, and she struck down off to the alley along with Eddie. But where was Kevin? "Meg, help!" cried the boy, and Meg turned around. Kevin was still at the door, and instantly Meg could see why. She'd shut the door so fast she caught the hood of his nylon jacket between the door and the jamb, and now Kevin was struggling to get the thing off, but the zipper was stuck. She ran back to him. "Stupid coat!" sobbed Kevin. "Stupid coat!" God, the door was starting to bulge outward, pushed with incredible force from the creature. She grabbed the zipper and tugged on its latch. It refused to budge. Tears ran down Kevin's face, and he mewed softly. Bubbles of slime squeezed through the bulging door. From the cracks oozed strands of the monster, blindly feeling around for prey. Then, one by one, the bolts of the door burst from their fittings. Behind her, she could hear Eddie yell, "Watch out! Hurry!" Why hadn't the kid run? With a strength born of desperation, Meg released the zipper and grabbed the front of Kevin's jacket. She pulled and ripped it wide open. Immediately, she tugged Kevin out of it and pushed him to one side. The creature spewed from the doorway, slapping across the alley, its deadly streaming tissue just missing Kevin and Meg and Eddie. "Come on," she cried, grabbing them and turning up from the surging tide of the monstrosity. They ran down the alley. Her lungs were on fire, but she ran for all she was worth, turned a corner, and hit a dead end. "There's no other way out," she cried. She could hear the garbage cans being hit by the creature as it probed out for them. She looked around and then down and caught sight of a manhole cover. Here, she cried. "Help me lift this." The boys helped her, putting their fingers in the pry holes and lifting the cover to one side with a clatter. At the corner, a dumpster borne on a wave of the monster smashed into the brick wall, crumbling and spewing trash, which was rapidly covered by the rolling, putrescent ooze. "Down," she ordered, grabbing Kevin and pushing him down into the hole. "Come on, you too," she said. But Eddie needed no urging. He was already jumping down in Kevin's wake. The blob hissed closer and closer. Meg stepped down the first 3 metal rungs, ducking down below ground level and grabbing the manhole cover by its side. Somehow she found the energy to pull it back over the hole. It clanged into place just as she sensed the blob pouring over it. She started moving farther down into the darkness where she could hear Kevin and Eddie moving around. Something grabbed at her hair. Strands of acidic slime were leaking down, tangled in her hair. With a scream, she jumped and felt a rip on her scalp as whole clumps were pulled away. She hit concrete piping. She could hear her hair sizzling above her. She rolled away, sloshing through the water at the bottom of the round pipe, not even noticing the terrible stench. She ran into a form and gasped. "Meg," cried Kevin, "it's us." Kevin and Eddie were waiting for her at a juncture of the piping in the dark. "Which way, Meg?" She pushed them in a random direction. One way is as good as another, as long as it headed away from that thing, dripping down behind them. Anthony Peters watched in disbelief as the stuff slammed through the theater exit door, cutting his friends off. What was that thing? The kid watched it as it poured out, assuming a bulbous shape as it rolled after its 3 intended victims. Anthony was so dazed he didn't think to just turn and run. Fascinated, he watched the slimy creature squirm down the alley like an inside-out giant worm. It disappeared around the corner. "Eddie!" he cried. Eddie was his best buddy. They were blood brothers, he and Eddie. He just couldn't leave him. Anthony ran after the creature. Maybe he could help Eddie and Meg and Kevin. When he turned the corner, he saw an astonishing thing. There was the pile of gunk that had chased them at the cul-de-sac of the alley, and it was dwindling in size. "Eddie?" he cried in horror as he noticed by the dim street lighting the half-eaten bodies bobbing inside the gelatinous ooze. Could it have gotten Eddie? But then Anthony realized that the thing wasn't disappearing. It was flowing down a manhole into the sewers. It was still chasing Eddie and Meg and Kevin. They might still be alive. "Help!" he cried, turning and running back out of the alley. "Somebody help!" He had to tell everybody there where the monster went. They had to save Eddie. It didn't take long for Brian Flagg to find his motorbike again, and it didn't take long to fix it with the help of Moss's ratchet. Now came the tricky part, getting away from this crazy place. Like there were soldiers swarming all over. Brian didn't dare get on his bike and start it. The thing was too loud, and this close to all this military activity, he'd be a goner. They'd hear him for sure, run out in their high-tech gadgets and grab him up, just like that. So he was walking his bike now through the undergrowth, trying to figure out the best way to sneak around the encampment to the road. Yikes! He ducked down behind a clump of bushes as two of the plastic suits carrying M16s marched by. Boy, and they had reinforcements too. One of the soldiers had a German shepherd at the end of the leash. The dog's nose was on the ground, sniffing away. One of the soldiers had a walkie-talkie. The sound of cross-chatter drifted over to Brian's ear from the device. "We got the town sealed, tight as a drum," said the voice from the walkie-talkie. "Roads closed. Phone lines severed. Civilian radio frequencies jammed. Over." The soldier turned and disappeared over a rise, the light from the flashlights bouncing ahead of them. This was the way, wasn't it? Thought Brian, getting back up and pushing his bike ahead of him. The one-lane road was just up ahead. If he could get there, he'd be home free. Of course, the best route was right past the area where the meteor had fallen. It was just as chancy as the alternatives, so Brian Flagg decided to try for it. Sure enough, there was the crash site, with all the vehicles and lights and equipment and stuff huddled around it. Brian skirted the periphery, the wheels of the bike rolling along beside him among the trees. The familiar burnt smell of the place wafted after him, along with the murmur of voices and the whirring of machinery. Just ahead, past a break in the trees, the moonlight washed across the narrow country road he'd been looking for, the one heading away from town. Yes, sir, he thought, smiling. Freedom's just ahead. And then he stopped. The machinery sound had stepped up in volume, and there was a whining sound. Brian knew that sound. It was the sound of a winch. Those dudes were hauling something up. The meteor? But how could they get a grip on a piece of rock? Intrigued, Brian carefully set his bike down and went over to check this out. One little peep wouldn't do any harm. He crawled up through some underbrush towards the top of the rise. Looking down, he had a good view of the crash site and the crater. Holy moly, they had a crane there all right, and he could hear the whining of the winch even better from here, as it pulled something up from the hole. Soldiers were clustered all around. Yeah, and wait, there was that old dude, Dr. Trimble, watching alongside Colonel Hargis and another guy. "Gently now, gently," Trimble was saying. The thing at the end of the crane was being lifted up out of the hole, and Brian could see it very clearly. It was a charred and battered orb, but its smooth metallic surface gleamed in the moonlight. Brian Flagg took in a breath. Geez, that was no meteor. That was a satellite. A man-made, shot up in the sky on the nose of a rocket satellite. The crane arm swung the demolished satellite away from the crater into the flatbed back of the truck waiting to transport away. But Dr. Bruno Trumbull watched the operation, cautioning the technicians to be careful. They were going to need everything here for their work, and they couldn't afford to leave any bits and pieces out in the countryside for someone to stumble across. No, there was too much at stake. "Incredible. Just incredible," said Dr. Janeway, a younger scientist. "Yes, isn't it?" said Trimble. "We've known for years that conditions in space have a mutating effect on bacteria." Dr. Janeway nodded. "But who could have guessed this?" Dr. Trimble smiled to himself. It was happening, his dream. He would prove once and for all that he had been right all along. For years his colleagues had merely humored him and his theories, but now, through this accident, there'd be no way they could patronize him. His name in bold face would go down in science book history for all ages. "Who indeed," he said. "Our little experimental virus seems to have grown up into a plasmic life form that hunts its prey. A predator, for God's sake. It's fantastic." What he didn't mention was what he'd accomplished was nothing less than a recreation of what had happened billions and billions of years ago in the seas of the earth. A bubbling broth of amino acids had mutated into life forms that fed on one another to survive, life forms that reproduced rapidly, forming colonies of cells which were the first living animals. He'd always thought the cosmic rays from space had had a great deal to do with that mutation, but he had no idea how extremely right he'd been. Putting that recreation of life's building blocks in a satellite, that chemical soup in a controlled environment, and then shooting it up past the shielding ozone layer. A brilliant move, one that had taken years to engineer. And now it had worked. But Dr. Janeway, a rather muddled sort, seemed slightly upset by this. "Sir," he was saying, "the organism is growing at a geometric rate. By all accounts, it's now 1,000 times its original mass." Colonel Hargis wasn't concerned about the creation of life. He had other fish to fry. "Gentlemen, this could be putting the U.S. defense systems years ahead of the Russians." What a petty mind, thought Trimble. Of course, those dollars the U.S. defense system had contributed weren't petty, and Trimble had taken them gladly. "You don't understand," said Janeway, clearly, quite troubled. "At this rate, there may be no U.S." "Nonsense," said Trimble. "All we have to do is contain it properly." He turned to Colonel Hargis. "This is an incredible breakthrough, and I want it treated as a matter of top national security." "Yes, sir," said Colonel Hargis. "We've got this town locked up tight." A radioman suddenly rushed up, clutching a field radio. "Colonel," he said, "we have a sighting." Colonel Hargis grabbed the phone and barked into the receiver. "Hargis here." A soldier's voice erupted loudly from the radiophone. In the background was the sound of a hysterically sobbing child. "Colonel," said the soldier reporting in, "we've got an eyewitness who says the organism pursued some civilians into the sewers." The child's voice bursted out over the radio. "My name is Anthony, and that thing has Eddie and Kevin and Meg down there." Dr. Trimble blinked. The sewer system, of course. That was where it probably traveled with greatest ease in its present form, and what better place to stopper the thing up? "Excellent," he said. "We need a schematic of the sewer system. We'll isolate it and contain it down there. I want that organism alive." "Well, what about the civilians?" asked Colonel Hargis. Dr. Trimble sighed. "I'm afraid, Colonel, that we are dealing with a matter of paramount importance. In this situation, civilians, I'm sorry to say, are expendable." The words rang in Brian Flagg's ears. "It's got Eddie and Kevin and Meg down there." Expendable? Outrage filled him. But more, Brian felt fear for Meg Penny. This was his fault. He felt ashamed. Most of all, he felt angry. That creature, that hungry blob of death. It was more important to these scientists, these military men, than the lives of the citizens of Morgan City. And though Morgan City had never done much for him, it was his home. And the people, well, they hadn't been much of a family to him, but they were all he had. And they were human beings, not monsters like those goons down there blithering, talking about Morgan City residents being expendable. A hand reached down and grabbed him by the shoulder, yanking him up. He found himself staring into the faceplate of a soldier. "What do you think you're doing?" the soldier demanded. As Brian struggled to get away, he could see the men down by the crater turning toward him. He caught Dr. Trimble's eyes, and he knew once that Trimble recognized him. Damn, he had to get out of there. Had to. He pulled out Moss's ratchet and cracked the soldier across the head with it. The man staggered back, dropping his gun, blood running into his eyes and down his nose, and gave off a blubbering scream. Brian lit out through the bushes, back for his bike, running for his life. He'd seen his death in Dr. Trimble's eyes. Trimble knew that he'd overheard. He raced to where he'd left his bike, lifted it up, kick-started it into grumbling life, and gunned the motor. Behind him he heard the loudspeaker blast away with a message. He recognized Trimble's amplified voice, and it sounded cold and menacing, echoing through the night above the sound of his growling motorbike. "We have an infected civilian trying to escape. Stop him at all costs before he reaches a populated area. Shoot to kill." Up ahead, bathed in moonlight, was the road to freedom, the road away from Morgan City. All he had to do to hit that road, put on some speed, and get the hell out of there. But he knew he couldn't do it. He knew now he couldn't leave Meg and the rest of Morgan City at the mercy of that mutated organism, that mutated scientist. He turned the handlebars, cutting a hard U-turn. If he could get around that army now. Above he could hear the distant sounds of helicopters. Ahead he could hear the yapping of dogs, the shouts of men. He cut off to the field past the trees and gunned the engine, zooming and bouncing along away from the main encampment. The whole crew of soldiers were running down the hill now toward him, and bright flowers of gunfire blossomed in the dark. The dogs were let loose, and he could hear them barking. A searchlight from the approaching helicopter raked along the field like a starship's laser, looking to fry one desperately fleeing biker. No, he thought, riding hard, riding low, it didn't look good. Didn't look good at all. But up ahead, all was clear. No soldiers coming toward him, and they were all behind him. And then the jeeps cut him off. The staccato blasts of gunfire ripped the ground just yards from him. These bastards meant business. He was trapped. Desperate, with only seconds left before they closed in on him, tight as a bear trap, he recognized where he was. Up ahead was that ridge over the waterbed, and the one with the jutting bridge ruins, the one that had beaten him before. It was his last hope. He turned around, gunned the bike, and jammed it into gear, racing for the gully. Even as he picked up speed, the dog pack closed in on him, snapping at his heels, but he upped his speed, racing ahead of them. He threw the throttle even wider, all the way, and then some. And just when he'd tried it before, the engine sputtered, the bike lost speed. The dogs gained. "Not now!" Brian Flagg cried. "Please!" He heard the sound of gunfire behind him. A bullet smashed his rearview mirror, shattering it. Come on, he cried. "Damn thing!" He stepped down on the kickstart. Hard. The engine screamed to life, and the bike rocketed forward with a burst of new speed. Brian hung on for dear life as the ramp of the bridge approached. "Whoa!" cried Brian, feeling as if he were surfing on a tornado. The ramp loomed. Brian's bike hit it. He felt the bike lift up with a tremendous surge, like the fiercest roller coaster ride imaginable. The helicopter's searchlight flashed across him briefly, but he was going too fast. It lost him, and then he started coming down. Coming down. Coming down. Heart in his throat, the wind blasting into his face. He had to concentrate on keeping the wheel straight, or he was lost. Wheel straight, wheel straight. Thump! Crunch! He landed, the wheels turning beneath him, and all his powers of balance were put to the test. Somehow, with the help of his shoes angled out against the old road, he stayed upright. He roared off into the night, flipping the bird to the barking dogs on the other side of the bridge. Brian Flagg gunned his motorbike and headed toward Morgan City. But he couldn't get there, not on his bike anyway. It was that helicopter, that goddamn whirlybird. It was after him, and fast as Brian Flagg was on his Indian bike, it was much faster. Its searchlight caught him once, but Brian pulled a neat, evasive maneuver, heading off to the west of Morgan City. Besides, he had an idea. He knew where he was going now, and he ate that distance quickly, the helicopter still on his tail. The aqueduct was up there in the foothills. Yeah, he thought, pushing the engine hard, praying it didn't quit on him. When he reached the aqueduct, he rolled down into the concrete riverbed. The helicopter swept past, searching. Gotta hide the bike, he thought, cutting the engine, laying the machine down in a pile of reeds. Then, dodging the probing searchlight, he splashed up through the trickle in the concrete riverbed, up to the dark cave of the entrance. He crouched down in the shadows by the huge round pipe. In the spring, when the snows in the mountains melted, Morgan City would have floated away, but for the system of aqueducts which dealt with the runoff were linked with the town's sewers. The helicopter zoomed past, and it kept going, giving no indication of having found him. Good. Brian Flagg looked into the darkness of the aqueduct pipe. Contain the thing. They must contain the thing, thought Dr. Trimble, as the jeep lurched to a stop by the impromptu command post in Morgan City. If they could trap it, it would be a matter of time before he could find the way to immobilize it. And then he could learn the true nature of this wonderful life he had created. Study it, get to know it, use it to create new mutants. Why, the secrets of life lay below him now in the sewers of Morgan City. How precious, how terribly precious. "Come on, Doc, over here," said Colonel Hargis, guiding him to where a soldier was hunched over a folding table, under a bank of lights. "I radioed ahead to get the information. Lieutenant Benton's got the stuff we need." The lieutenant welcomed them, and they declined the offered coffee. Then Lieutenant Benton gestured down to the sheets of schematics spread across the table in front of them. "The whole goddamn town's sitting on a system of aqueducts," he said, "run off from the mountains." "Can we trap the thing down there?" asked Hargis. "There seems to be 3 main junctions." Benton tapped 3 times over the map. "Here, here, and here. We close off those valves. I think we got it." "Excellent," said Dr. Trimble. "How fortunate it chose Morgan City to descend upon." "Just hope it stays in the pipes if you want it alive," said Colonel Hargis. "I want it alive, Colonel, whether or not it stays down there. Do you understand me?" "I don't know, sir. Isn't it just as good to us dead? I mean, can't you do an analysis from a dead—" Trimble shot the officer a glare that stopped him talking fast. Alive, Colonel, alive. Now start getting those valves closed pronto. And what about storm drains, for God's sakes? We're working on those, sir, promised Benton. So do it, said Trimble. A team of soldiers for every valve. Now! Colonel Hargis scrambled off to do his duty. Dr. Trimble smiled to himself. Maybe I should have been a general, he thought. No, he told himself, thinking about his creation oozing beneath the streets of Morgan City. As a general, he'd never have hoped to have had a night as thrilling as this. The aqueducts and sewer system below Morgan City were built in the 50s, after perennial flooding problems finally forced the town to raise the necessary capital. The builders had not used stone, as the Romans had in their original aqueducts, but rather huge concrete pipes. Now Meg Penny walked within one of those pipes, guiding her little brother Kevin and his friend Eddie through the maze of dark, drippy tunnels, slogging through ankle-deep water. Somewhere in the networks of tunnels, she knew the creature lurked. Somehow they'd gotten away from it for a time. How, she had no idea. She didn't even care about losing the hair. She was just happy they'd gotten away. But now they were lost, and she had to find the way out. The only lights that were dim maintenance bulbs, widely spaced along the tunnels. But they had to keep going. They had to find a way out. Getting back to the street was their only hope. If they stayed down here too long, the monster was bound to find them. They had to get out. Eddie was wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve and snuffing back tears. Is it still after us? He wanted to know. I don't think so, said Meg, noticing how their voices echoed and carried down here, wondering if that thing had ears. Quiet now. Kevin was in bad shape. She could feel him trembling. I'll be good, I swear, he said. I'll never go to the movies again. It's going to be okay, Kev, she said, wishing she believed it. Come on, let's find a way out of here. In another tunnel not far away, 3 heavily armed soldiers in plastic suits made their way slowly forward, weapons at the ready. Corporal Dennis Johnstone held in his hands the map that would guide them to the valve they had to close. Private Bill North's heavy-duty flashlight probed the steamy darkness ahead. He leaned over to speak to Sergeant Henry Washington. Sergeant, said North. Sergeant North jumped, startled. What? I think I hear something. That's the sound of me having a heart attack, you idiot, said the sergeant. Corporal, let's see the map. Christ, we'll never find that goddamn valve. Sarge, said Corporal Johnstone, directing his own flashlight to an area behind them. The sergeant looked. The beam picked out a bright red valve wheel. All right, let's close it up and get out of here. They went to deal with the wheel. At just about the same time, Meg and the boys entered a large chamber. Several tunnels connected here, up on the walls of the chamber. The floor, though, was a lake of muddy water. At the far end of the chamber was a concrete spill-off ramp. Look, said Kevin. Look up there, Meg. From the top of the chamber there was a spill of street light lamp coming through an open storm drain above. How do we get up there? Said Eddie, whining. As Meg's eyes adjusted to the increased illumination, she saw the answer. Those pipes over there. We can climb those pipes. There was a series of cross-brace pipes running up the wall to the storm drain. Come on, that's our way out. But first they had to wade through the fetid lake. Meg stepped in, and it was nearly up to her waist, but still not too deep for the boys, thank God. They splashed in after her, revitalized by the sight of a way out. As she waded, Meg heard the sound of a soft squealing. She looked around and found herself nose to whiskers with a large grizzled rat patting the water nearby. Ugh, watch out for the rat, she warned the boys. She looked away just as the rat was tugged under the water. What rat? Asked Kevin. She looked back, and there was no swimming rat. But farther on the spotted another rat clinging to a floating piece of garbage. Even as she watched, the rat was sucked under. The creature, it was close. She turned to the boys. Come on, she said. Hurry! They hurried all right, but the trouble was that concrete bottom of this chamber was slippery as hell with crud and mud. Meg heard a whirring sound behind them. She looked around, and in the dim light she saw the water churning, and the churning was getting closer. What happened? Asked Eddie, noticing as well. Go! Meg cried. Go! After what seemed an eternity jammed into a few seconds, they reached the network of pipes riding up the wall to the storm drain. Get up there, Kevin! Cried Meg, boosting her little brother up onto the pipe first. Kevin's foot caught hold, and his hands started pulling him out of the water and onto the wall. Okay, Eddie, she said. You too now. She grabbed him to boost him up as well, but with a speed that astonished her, Eddie was suddenly ripped from her grasp. Like a half-submerged skier, he shot through the water, back across the chamber, splatting up the spray of water. Eddie! Yelled Meg. Eddie screamed all the way, and then halfway back to the other edge of the water, Eddie was sucked under. Meg Penny, hysterical, jumped out after him, trying to drag him back. Kevin Penny, on the pipes, horrified, saw his sister vanish beneath the surface in Eddie's wake. His shock broke loose in a cry. "Meg! No!" The turbulence in the water settled. Kevin could see nothing beneath the turbid calm. Kevin could not move. He felt as though he were frozen on the pipes. His sister, Eddie, both down there under the water, with that awful, horrible, gummy, sticky, hungry creature. It was too much to take, and the young boy's mind seemed to snap for a moment from the overload. "Meg, oh Meg," he thought, "it got you, it got—" But then a head bobbed up from the surface, flinging off water from long hair. It was Meg. That thing hadn't gotten her. "Eddie?" Meg Penny cried. The loss of the little boy was just too much. Her mind was spinning as she gasped for air and swung her head around looking for him. "It got him!" Kevin yelled at her. "Get out of there, Meg! It got Eddie!" She couldn't believe it. They'd been so close, so very close to escaping. Meg waded back towards the pipes, still hoping that maybe it hadn't gotten Eddie, that she could save him, bring him back to his parents. An explosion of water directly in front of her. "Eddie!" The boy burst up from the water, and for a moment hope filled Meg. But then she saw the expression on Eddie's face, twisted in the throes of death, and she saw the stuff wrapped around his head. Gummy liquefaction. The creature. Meg screamed, and Eddie was jerked back under, thrashing and struggling. Eyes almost popped from their sockets. Fear drove her legs forward. She raced for the pipes. She had to get out of here. Had to get out. She reached up the side of the chamber and grabbed the first pipe. "Up!" she cried. "Kevin, go up!" She couldn't get help but look behind as Kevin turned and started climbing up the pipes towards the drain pipe. The creature was rising up from the water. The top of it looked like the head of a cancerous jellyfish, rippling with inner gases. But then it lifted up higher and higher, an island of bloody mucus quivering and sozzly. But the faint light, Meg could see the half-dissolved bits of human carcass hanging in the colloidal stuff like obscene fruit and satanic jello mold. She climbed frantically. Above her, Kevin slipped. She was far enough up to catch him. She set his feet back on the pipes and pushed him up. "Keep going," she ordered. There was only room enough for one of the storm drain openings. As Kevin clambered up through it, Meg ventured another look below. That thing was still growing, and even more of it pouring in from the other drains like never-ending flowing mucus from subterranean nasal passages. The thing had become immense beyond imagining. "Oh my God," said Meg. She turned back to deal with Kevin. She had to concentrate on getting Kevin up that drain. Hanging on with one hand, she shoved him up the last yard, and Kevin wriggled through onto the street to freedom. "I did it, Meg. Here, grab hold," he cried, turning back and holding down his hand. She scrabbled up, took his hand, and pushed for all she was worth up through the narrow opening. But she stuck. She didn't fit. It was too narrow. Nonetheless, it was her only hope. She struggled desperately, trying to squeeze herself through, Kevin pulling on her, but her shoulders were completely wedged in. As she struggled, she imagined the thing behind her rising pseudopods forming and whipping, sensing its prey above, reaching for another juicy morsel of flesh and blood. "Run, Kevin," she cried. "Run! I can't make it!" But Kevin just kept on pulling. The soldiers in the tunnel nearby heard her shouts, and they came running into the chamber. There they were, confronted by the growing bulbous form of the creature they had been ordered to contain. It was reaching up for a pair of legs sticking from the storm drain. "What the hell?" said the private, automatically raised his M16. But the sergeant pushed the barrel from its aim. "That's the thing, all right, but we have orders not to shoot." "But, Sarge, what the hell else are we—" the corporal was beginning. Then a coil of something shot around the legs of the sergeant and dragged him off his feet. With a scream, the sergeant was yanked through the water and into the oleaginous mass in the chamber. "Fuck orders," said the corporal, opening fire. Meg Penny heard the screams and the shots. Nothing had touched her exposed legs, but she still couldn't get through the storm drain. She collected her wits and her nerve and tried to speak calmly to Kevin. "Kevin, run the town hall." "But do it now!" Kevin, nodding, got up and started to run off down the street. She couldn't get through. There had to be another way. Meg Penny thought as she backed up, scooted down the rough concrete drain, and started climbing down the drain pipes. The creature seemed preoccupied. The creature was devouring Sergeant Washington, who bellowed and screamed, fighting it. The corporal had waded out into the water, and the light from his blasting rifle sputtered harshly as the bullets ripped into the creature. But then the ground beneath him seemed to swell up. He looked around and saw a flap of stuff lift up from the water. "You're standing on it!" cried the private, still at the lip of the tunnel. "Shit!" cried the corporal, who tried to run around the flap, but then curtains of slime erupted all around him, slapping him like a gigantic Venus flytrap. Meg Penny did not watch the flailing soldier being pulled down into the creature. She splashed along in the shallows toward her last hope, the spill-off drain at the far side of the chamber. She scrambled up the concrete ramp. It was hungry. It was hungry, and it fed. Feeding made it hungrier. As it had rolled through the building of the surface, sucking into many of the animate hunks of flesh, it had known such ecstasy, such pleasure, sucking the blood, dissolving the bones, feeling the hot life stuff of its victims mix in with its own juices into a delightful, boiling stew, making it grow and grow, able to eat more and more and more. Now in the dark places it swarmed about the plastic creatures, easily dissolving this odd new skin, sucking out the life in the juices, thrilling at the sensations. The spattering hunks of metal had been odd, but the blob paid them no mind, forging ahead in its single-minded objectives. Find food. Eat food. It had been pursuing food that was climbing up towards the light, but then it had been distracted by the creatures wrapped in the plastic suits, distracted by the bullets. But now the blob was no longer distracted. It set back after the food, which was no longer at the top of the pipes, but running through the water trying to escape. It moved toward it like a wave toward a shore. It sensed the pulsing blood in its victim's veins, and it sensed the victim's fear. The blob reached for the food, famished. The blob was terribly, horribly hungry. It had been a simple enough decision. A little odd, but definitely workable. That tunnel had been awfully dark, and Brian Flagg had only one source of light available to him, the headlight on this Indian motorbike. And it wasn't as if the pipes weren't big enough. No, they were huge. 2 + 2 = 4 every time. Brian Flagg roared through the aqueduct system on his motorbike. He didn't know where he was going, he just went. Meg Penny was down here. Meg and her brother Kevin and his friend Eddie. That was what the voice was over the radio had said. Then as he whipped through the dimness, his headlight striking out ahead of him, he heard the screams. The screams and the shots. He found the turn and roared off toward the sounds, down the incline of the pipe. It was a girl's scream he heard. Meg Penny's scream. He hurried. Then he saw a faint light at the end of his tunnel. The pipe opened up there into a chamber at the bottom of the pipe's concrete spill-off, and there in that chamber, surging up from the water like a pustulant boil, was the creature. And there, on the spillway, scrambling up the ramp like a poor, half-drowned mouse, was Meg Penny. Brian Flagg roared up to the lip of the pipe, leaned over, and reached out. That thing was reaching out, too, with a pseudopod the size of a log. But Brian's hand grabbed her outstretched hand, and he pulled her up. The pseudopod hit the spillway hard, slopping off and just missing Meg's feet as they were pulled up. "Brian," she said. He pulled her onto his bike. She wrapped her arms around him. He turned the handlebars and he gunned the engine. They roared off back through the tunnel. "Brian, you came back," she said, holding on for dear life as the bike zoomed away, the headlights slicing through the darkness. Now, which way had he come? Brian Flagg wondered. But then a blank wall reared up before them, and Brian put on the brakes and came to a skittering stop. Dead end? He'd gone the wrong way. He turned and saw the way he should have gone, but then they reached the intersection. There was something blocking them. Brian stopped, startled. There hadn't been a closure when he'd gone this way through the tunnel. A what? And then he saw what had blocked the tunnel. A sheath of thick protoplasm. From the slotted vents above and below, sticky stuff was still rolling through. They were cut off. There was only one thing to do. "Hang on, Meg." He turned the bike and he headed back toward the chamber. Up ahead, limned in the dim light from the chamber, he could see the creature's main bulk. It was flopping up the tunnel straight toward them. Brian Flagg revved the engine higher and higher. He pointed the headlights straight at the massive globular nightmare coming for them. "What are you doing?" cried Meg, disbelieving. The thing was squeezing through vents, rippling through every side of them, sending out tendrils that just missed trapping them in goo. Brian pushed the bike harder, harder, getting up speed as they approached collision with the thing. At the last possible moment, he turned the handlebars. The bike screamed up the side of the pipe at a 45-degree angle and then kept on going, the centrifugal force keeping the wheels on concrete and keeping Brian Flagg and Meg Penny in their seats. They rolled right over the monster, sweeping down in a spiral behind its mass. "Brian!" Meg cried. They tore toward the chamber, wind whipping through his hair. and through Brian's torn jacket, adrenaline pumping through him madly. Brian kept his hand hard on the throttle. That thing back there was fast, and they couldn't afford losing one bit of speed so close to it. Now if he could only navigate that spillway. They burst from the tunnel, hung in the air for a moment, and then landed on the spillway, at the wrong angle. Both Brian and Meg were lifted from the seat and hurled over the handlebars as the motorbike slammed onto the concrete, cracking the headlight as it tumbled and crashing downward. They flew asses over elbows, landing in the middle of the small underground lake. Brian fought his way to the surface. "Meg!" he cried, gasping. His leg hurt like hell. He must have struck it in the tumble. Something was bobbing beside him. He grabbed it, and it was loose and globby in his grasp. By the dim maintenance light he could see the half-eaten body of a man, the remnants of a plastic suit. "Over here, Brian!" Meg called. Shuddering, Brian pushed the dead man away, and the body softly sank out of sight. Meg was just a few yards off. "Over here," she cried, gasping for breath. "That tunnel over there, it's free. It's the way the soldiers came in." Soldiers, yes. They must have been the ones to fire those shots, and that must have been one of them, half digested, he'd run into just now. They splashed the flail through the water. When they reached the tunnel, Brian limped ahead. "You okay?" asked Meg. "Yeah, it must have hit my leg when the bike went over," he said. They hurried on. A form separated from the shadows and stood in the way. They yelped, startled. They almost ran into him. It was a soldier in a white suit, laden with equipment. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, frightened as they. In fact, Brian could see there was a stunned look on the man's face, a glaze. "He got him," he said. "John Stone and the Sarge." His faceplate was cracked. Blood streamed down his face. "How do we get out of here?" demanded Brian. The man didn't even seem to hear them. They were trying to scream inside it. They were trying to scream. Brian grabbed the front of the man's plastic suit and shook him. Then he pushed him up against the wall. "You gotta show us the way out," he cried. The soldier cringed away, whimpering. Brian could see now that his arm was flopping at an unnatural angle. The arm's busted. He caught a glimpse of shattered bone sticking through the plastic of the suit. "Oh, Jesus," said Brian. "Brian!" cried Meg, gesturing desperately back toward the junction chamber. He looked. He could see the quick movements there, the gushing glob of the monster pouring back through the pipes, reforming, seeking them. The soldier caught sight of this as well. He stepped back, turned, and started running the opposite way through the tunnel. "Follow him," said Brian. "He'll know the way out." They ran, and they ran, and they ran some more. The soldier ran hard despite the equipment weighing him down. Strapped to one side of the man was a walkie-talkie. As they ran, the walkie-talkie began to speak. Baker team! What the hell's going on down there?" The soldier didn't answer. He just kept running. A few seconds later, the soldier stopped, breathing harshly. Immediately above him, a vertical shaft ran up toward the surface, ridged with a metal runged ladder and topped, no doubt, by a manhole. The way out. "This is it," said Brian, looking up. Not only was the manhole up there, it was an open manhole. He could see stars glittering overhead, and a face was peering down toward them. "We're coming up!" cried Brian, pulling Meg over and guiding her hand to the first rung. More plastic-suited men ringed the manhole, and two more faces peered down. Faces that Brian recognized. Dr. Trimble and Colonel Hargis. And they saw him. Recognized him. Oh, shit. "Close the manhole," said Dr. Trimble. "What?" said the other man. "That's my man down there," said Colonel Hargis. "We have to contain that thing," said Dr. Trimble, looking down at Brian, cold ice in his eyes. "Now close it off. That's an order." "No," cried Meg, as the manhole cover scratched across the pavement and rattled into place. "No," cried the wounded soldier, seeing what was happening. "No!" "Hell," said Brian. He climbed up the ladder. He was going to push that thing off before they could do anything about it. Oh, hell. He could hear a truck. They were going to put a goddamn truck tire over the manhole cover. Sure enough, by the time he reached the top and pushed hard, the thing didn't budge. Not a half inch. "You son of a bitch!" cried Brian. No good being up here. He stormed down the ladder. Below, the soldier was fiddling with his walkie-talkie. He flicked a switch and spoke into it. "Colonel, you can't. That thing's down here with us." Brian grabbed the walkie-talkie from him. "Trimble, you hear me?" he cried into the receiver. No answer. "Talk to me, man." Then he noticed a chill around his feet. A pressure. "The water's rising," said the soldier. "It's coming for us." Brian looked down. Sure enough, the water level was inching up, lapping now at their ankles. The soldier whimpered and fell across the wall, beginning to weep with hopelessness. God, they were trapped. That was it, thought Brian. They were going to get eaten, dissolved, digested, just like the others. Damn. He looked at Meg, and she was staring at him in a funny way. I thought you were going to look after yourself, she said. Yeah, guess I blew it, huh? He looked around, shrugged, sighed. I'm sorry, Meg. I really am. Me too. Then she was looking at something else. Brian, she said. Yeah? She pointed down at the soldier against the wall coming apart. On his belt. Brian, look. Brian looked. One of the pieces of equipment the soldier carried was strapped to his belt. Brian recognized it from war movies. It was a handheld grenade launcher. There were words stenciled along the metal side. Explosive projectile. Caution. Blowback. Oh, yes. Perfect. He looked at her, and to think he had given up. He grinned, kissed her hard on the lips, and stooped down. He grabbed the grenade launcher and pulled it off the soldier's belt. Does this thing work? He asked. The soldier nodded. With his good hand, he reached up and yanked back a cocking lever. It won't do any good. Not against that monster. Brian looked up the shaft. He put the walkie-talkie to his lips, thumbed the on switch. Hey, Trimble, if you won't listen to me, then listen to this. He aimed the grenade launcher up the shaft. Meg and the soldier scrambled out of the way for cover. Brian's finger found the trigger, and he pulled it. The launcher tugged like a bucking bronco in his arms, but the missile went true. In less than a blink of an eye, it tore up the vertical shaft to the manhole cover at the top. Brian stepped to one side. The very instant of the explosion, metal and broken cement rained down, along with pieces of blown-up tire. It felt as though someone had clapped Brian on his ears. They were ringing like bells, but he was okay. Checking with the dust from the explosion, he picked himself up and called out, "Come on, folks, we got ourselves a way out." As quick as they could, they climbed the ladder, Brian first. He had something important to do. The fresh night air struck him, revitalizing him, as he lifted himself out onto the street, gratified at the sight that met his eyes. Chaos! The truck that had been standing on the manhole cover was flipped on its side, and so had a lot of soldiers, including Brian could see Dr. Trimble, who just lay yards away, dazed, struggling to get back on his feet. Brian jumped through, clearing the way for Meg and the soldier to get out. His eyes raked along the rubble on the ground. He saw what he needed. He scooped it up, an M16 rifle. He swung it toward Dr. Trimble. God, how he wanted to kill that bastard. A voice stopped him. "Flag, drop it!" He spun. Peripherally, he could see Meg crawling out of the hole, then the soldier with Meg's help. But just past them stood Deputy Billy Briggs, leveling his service revolver. "It's a lie!" he cried. "All of it!" "I said put it down!" cried Briggs. "I'll blow you out of your shoes, boy." Dr. Trimble was used to the time, picking himself up. "Shoot him!" he cried to Colonel Hargis. Colonel Hargis raised his rifle but hesitated. Brian could read the doubt in his eyes. The man, for all his hawkishness, wasn't as loony as the scientists, and this business was getting thoroughly crazed. "Shoot him?" said Briggs. "Shoot him? What is this, Russia?" The deputy swung his revolver, covering Trimble and Hargis. There were clicking sounds as the other soldiers swung their weapons on Briggs and Brian. "All right, hold it," said Briggs. "Everybody, just put your guns down." "He's infected," said Trimble, pointing at Brian. "Contagious! He'll spread a plague through this town and kill all of you." Then Brian noticed that there were townspeople gathering around. At the word plague, they gasped and they drew back. That even got to Briggs. He swung his revolver around and put it on Brian. "Listen to me, Briggs," said Brian Flagg desperately. "Think for a minute. You suppose an army of guys in plastic suits shows up every time a meteor falls?" "Shoot him!" cried Trimble. "That is a direct order." "How'd they get here so quickly? How'd they even know where to come?" "Shoot, damn it!" Trimble yelled. "Shoot!" "I'll tell you how," Brian continued. "That meteor is man-made. It's a satellite. Some kind of germ warfare test they fucked up." Maddened by Brian's words, the scientist jumped over to Colonel Hargis and wrestled his M16 from his grasp. He swung it around, cocking it. "Don't try it," said Briggs, and the rifle went off. Blam! Blam! The bullet sliced through the air, whizzing past Brian's ear. He jumped and pulled Meg down, covering her as Dr. Trimble fired at them wildly. A bullet caught Deputy Briggs in the shoulder, and his gun was knocked to the ground. Silence dropped into the battlefield as Dr. Trimble swung the rifle toward where Brian Flagg huddled with Meg Penny. "You're the infection boy, and I'm the penicillin," said Dr. Trimble. Brian was suddenly looking down the bore of the army rifle as the doctor tightened his finger, his aim better this time. Then something whipped out from the manhole, a pseudopod flung out, catching Dr. Trimble's ankles. His finger squeezed the trigger, but the shot went wide as he was tugged into the ground. "What?" he cried as the tendril pulled him toward the manhole. Dr. Trimble yelled and kicked as he was dragged along, tangled in the M16's strap. "Help!" he cried. "Help!" It was the creature. Brian thought, getting up, the creature reaching up from the sewers. Everyone just watched, stunned and unable to do anything, as Dr. Trimble was pulled down into the manhole. The rifle caught on the sides of the manhole, stopping him. "Help me!" he cried. "Please help me!" His voice was muffled through the plastic and the faceplate. Then the doctor started screaming, jerking violently, caught there in the manhole. Brian watched as something oozed and swelled up within the helmet, bubbling up over the man's head from within. And Brian could see the awareness in the doctor's eyes. He knew exactly what was happening. And then those bulging eyes were engulfed in slime. The M16 strap broke. Dr. Trimble was sucked away from sight. From the sewers of Morgan City there arose a squishing, squelching sound. The monster was eating and growing.